Welcome to Gradeful, where right now we're going over College Board's Practice Test 2, Section 1, starting at question 18. In a previous video, we've already done questions 1 through 17. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Question 18. The main idea of the final paragraph is, so looking through and looking for the main idea of this paragraph, we're going to be focusing on subjects and verbs. So we can never make rational decisions. Economists, a wave of economists here is trying to understand our psychology. So what are the economists trying to do? They're trying to understand our psychology. Why? So they can, just looking for another verb here, so they can anticipate. So a new wave of economists is trying to understand our psychology. They're going to anticipate our decisions in the marketplace more accurately. Psychology can help us understand why we react in disgust or why we accept the moral law as universal. So the science of human behavior might also define ethics for us. Economists would emerge from one of the least likely places, economists themselves. So just a tough passage overall, and we know this. So sometimes you got to get through these things, especially on the SAT, where the reading level is just overall so high. But what's the paragraph saying? It's saying that we can never make rational decisions. Behavioral economists is trying to understand our psychology. Why? So they can anticipate our decisions. Psychology is also going to help understand our reactions to things, or our decision, once again, our decisions that we make. And it's going to lead to the next step in economics and ethical economics, which might come from the economists themselves. So the main part in that is the idea of the psychology that is going to an understanding of the psychology is going to help us understand lots of other things. So generally, it's about the effect of psychology and what we can do based on a better understanding of psychology, if I can spell it right. So the main idea of the final paragraph is human quirks make it difficult to predict. Well, the human quirks are the psychology that we're reading into. So in anything, they might make it easier to predict. People react with disgust when faced with economic injustice. Just totally irrelevant. We're not seeing anything about that in here. Looking at C, understanding human psychology may help us define ethics and economics. That sounds exactly like what we were just talking about. And going over to choice D, economists will be responsible. Now, choice D is particularly tempting here, I would say. But what's the problem? The problem with it is that it speaks a lot later in the passage. So in the passage, it says, the science of human behavior might define ethics. And then if maybe that happens, the economics would maybe then emerge from one of the least likely places, which is the economists themselves. Okay, just fix that little issue there. Thanks, guys, for being patient. So economics would emerge from the economists themselves. So the wording there is very light. There was a might and a maybe going on. And so when we say will in choice D, that's a definitive term. Like in math and data collection, we're not supposed to have definitive answers in there. So it's just a little strong for what we're going for. We saw that this may happen, and choice D says, yes, this is definitely going to happen. So that's what's wrong with choice D. And in question 18, the answer is going to end up being C right there. So let's go over to number 19 now. Data in the graph strongly support which of the following statements? So one thing test prep tutors just love nerding out about is the idea that data is a plural word, which is why data support things, not data supports things. So if you want to be a nerd like us, get with it on that wording there. But going to the question now. So we're looking at the graph, and what are we seeing in this graph? We're seeing that The regular profits are being compared to fair trade profits. The fair trade profits are here. The regular profits are here. So what we're seeing when we try to answer based on the general trend of the graph, which is what you always want to do first, even though the SAT can make things look complicated, they'll then ask questions about really simple things. So if you're thinking complicated and the answer is simple, it makes sense that we'll be kind of misled, right? So the general trend is that the fair trade profits are more than the conventional profits, the regular coffee profits. So that's choice A right here for number 19. Fair trade coffee consistently earned greater profits than regular coffee for number 19. Let's go ahead and go to number 20. The greatest difference between the two occurred during which period? And looking at the graphs, the top one is very consistent. The bottom one bottoms out around here. So right around here is where the distance between the two is the greatest, from 2002 to 2004. So the answer number 20 is B. Going over to 21 now. So 21 says, data in the graph, once again, plural data, gives us direct support for what idea? So what's the idea here? The idea, in our own words, is that when we act based on ethics, because the paragraph was about ethics in economics, we're going to make more profits across the board because there's more profits for the ethical, for the fair trade coffee. So acting on empathy can be counterproductive. Well, if anything, the graph tells us that acting on empathy can be productive. Ethical economics is defined by character. Ethics and character are kind of the same thing. So we're not seeing anything in the passage or in the graph telling us how ethics and character connect. It's kind of an obvious thing. And ethical economics is still possible. Well, we're seeing here ethical economics is profitable because when we were more ethical, we had higher profits up here. So possible and profitable, I'm okay with keeping that. And people fear losses more than they hope for gains. I don't see anything in here at all about fearing losses or in the passage. So we can kind of easily get rid of D. It's also irrelevant. So the answer to number 21 is going to be C. And now for question number 22, we're getting into a new passage. So let's go ahead and get a first look at that passage. Like we always say over here at Gradeful, when we're approaching a passage for the first time, we want to read really fast. We want to speed read the passage. The idea being that we're going to be very specific when we zoom in to answer each question later. And so it's not really worth our while at this moment to really get too deep into our reading. And one way to speed read is to focus on verbs. So let's go ahead and model that. You always want to read the introduction at the beginning. So this passage comes from the idea that the web shatters focus, rewires brains. So passage 1 is going to be against the internet and the web, saying that it shatters our focus. Passage 2 is saying mind over mass media. So it's a little more vague there. We don't necessarily know, looking at this, what passage 2 is going to be talking about. So passage 1, the consequences of our online info crunching are not universally bad. Cognitive skills are strengthened by computers in the net. These tend to involve more primitive mental functions. One study of video gaming revealed that after just 10 days of playing on computers, young people had boosted the speed that they could shift their visual focus between various images. It's likely that web browsing also strengthens brain functions related to fast-paced problem solving when it requires spotting patterns in a welter of data. The study of women indicated that an experienced internet user can assess the trustworthiness and probable value of a web page in seconds. The more we practice surfing and scanning, the more adept our brain becomes at those tasks. But it would be a mistake to look narrowly at the benefits and conclude that the web is making us smarter. In an article, a psychologist reviewed more than 40 studies. She concluded, one second here while I reorient this. She concluded that every medium develops some skill at the expense of others. Our use of the net and other technologies has led to the widespread development of those skills, but those skills go hand in hand with a weakening of our capacity for the deep processing that underpins mindful knowledge. So this seems to be almost like the main idea of the whole passage. Those gains go hand in hand with a weakening of our capacity for deep processing that underpins mindful acquisition, analysis, thinking, imagination, and reflection. We know that the human brain is highly plastic. Neurons and synapses change as circumstances change. When we adapt to a new cultural phenomenon, we end up with a different brain. That means that our online habits continue to reverberate in the workings of the brain cells when we're not at a computer. We are exercising the neural circuits devoted to skimming and multitasking while ignoring those used for reading and thinking deeply. So here we're seeing the idea that if you spend too much time on the computer, it literally changes your brain, and not always in a good way. You may gain some skills and lose other critical skills. So that's one view. So we're almost imagining, before we get into passage 2, that it's going to disagree with that and say that using computers and devices doesn't change your brain. But let's go ahead and see. So critics use science to press their case, citing research that shows that experience can change the brain. But neuroscientists roll their eyes at such talk. Every time we learn a fact or skill, the wiring of the brain changes. It is not as if the information is stored in the pancreas, but the existence of neuroplasticity does not mean that the brain is a blob of clay pounded into shape by experience. Experience does not revamp the basic processes of the brain. Speed readings programs, ironically enough, have long claimed to do just that, but the verdict was rendered by Woody Allen after he read Leo Tolstoy's famous novel, War and Peace, in one sitting. It was about Russia. And that's wonderful for what we're trying to do. You want to come out of one of these passages and say, hey, this was about this, because later on we're going to come back and read it again. Unlike Woody Allen, when he read War and Peace in one sitting, he wasn't planning on coming back to it later like we are. Multitasking has been exposed as a myth, not just by lab studies, but by the sight of an SUV undulating between lanes as the driver cuts deals on his cell phone. The effects of experience are highly specific to the experience themselves. If you train people to do one thing, they get better at doing that thing, but almost nothing else. Music doesn't make you better at math. Conjugating doesn't make you more logical. Brain training doesn't make you smarter. Accomplished people don't bulk up their brains. They immerse themselves in their fields. Novelists read lots of novels. Scientists read lots of science. The effect of consuming electronic media are likely to be far more limited than the panic implies. Media critics write as if the brain takes on the qualities of what it consumes. You are what you eat. As with ancient people who believe that eating fierce animals makes them fierce, they assume that watching quick cuts and rock videos turns your mental life into quick cuts, or that reading bullet points, ing words are not verbs, reading bullet points and online postings churns your thoughts into bullet points and online postings. So this is saying that there is this great belief that, using too much technology is going to change you, but it's kind of mocking that view, saying that, yeah, that's what people assume, but look how ridiculous that is. Like, watching rock videos is going to churn your thoughts into bullet points and online postings. So it's kind of pointing out the sort of ridiculousness of that view. So let's look at number 22 now. The author of passage 1 indicates which of the following is very vague. And when you have a vague answer, you have a vague question, you want to cheat. Now, we don't mean cheat on the SAT. That's all over the news these days. But what we mean is you want to glance at the answer choices, although generally we discourage that on most questions. So does passage 1 say that screen-based technologies should be thoroughly studied, that they make the brain rigid, that screen-based technologies has some positive effects, or that it should be widely encouraged? So as we were looking through all the verbs that we already highlighted, it says that the consequences are not universally bad. Some skills are strengthened. So right there, only 3 lines into the passage, we're seeing that some things are strengthened. There are some positive effects. So the answer to number 22 is going to be C. Where do we get the evidence to that? Well, we were looking on line 3, but let's just double check. Certain cognitive skills are strengthened by our use of computers and the net. Yeah, that definitely supports the idea that there are some positive effects. So the answer to 23 is going to be A. The author of passage 1 indicates that becoming adept at using the internet can do what? Once again, really vague. When the question is vague, that's your one time to cheat off the answer choices, to glance at them just a little bit here and there to know what they're looking for. So does passage 1 say that becoming adept at using the internet can make people complacent about their health? Well, that just sounds ridiculous. Why do we care about their health in this conversation, their overall health? Undermine the ability to think deeply? Sounds like what we read in passage 2. Thinking to myself, no, it does sound like what we read in passage 1, so let's keep it. Increase people's social contacts. That's also ridiculous. Do we care in terms of what we were reading? How many contacts a person has in their contact folder? Improve people's self-confidence. Confidence, feeling good about yourself or bad about yourself. These are just like so way off topic that it's fairly easy on 24 to pick B, but we never want to pick an answer without visually getting our eyes on the line that backs that up. So let's just take an extra second to see where the passage says that becoming adept at the internet can undermine our deep thinking ability. And let's see where we saw it. Maybe around line 34, where it says those gains that we get from certain gains from using a lot of technology go hand in hand with a weakening of our capacity for the mindful, deep process that underpins mindful knowledge acquisition, analysis, critical thinking, imagination, and reflection. So, right there is the view that as using a lot of video games or the web is improving us in certain ways, it's also weakening our capacity for certain deeper skills, undermining our ability to think deeply. So the answer number 24 is going to be B, based on lines 34 to 38. So that's number 24. Now going to 25. For a passage-based vocab question, you want the momentary main idea. So if it's line 40, generally speaking, I'm going to want to know what's being said on 35 to 45. And once you have the momentary main idea, you want to kind of try to invent your own word to fill that space. So line 40, the word plastic is right here in purple. And what's the main thing that was going on around there? We know that the human brain is highly plastic. Neurons and synapses change as circumstances change. When we adapt to a new phenomenon, including the use of a new whatever, we're expecting to see on the next line it says that something else changes. So the mind is plastic. In my words, I'll say they're using plastic as the word changeable. So we know that the human brain is highly changeable. Neurons and synapses change as circumstances change. So now that makes sense to us, sort of inventing our own word in that space. Does creative mean changeable? Well, it kind of does, but at its heart, creative means coming up with new ideas. Artificial means fake. Malleable, let's just say we don't know the definition of that word. We'll leave it for later. Sculptural would be the idea of having to do with sculpture or something like that, or that, you know, when you sculpt something, if you want to be really technical, you're removing bits and pieces of it in order to create a shape. So we're not removing bits and pieces of our brain. Malleable, the definition actually means changeable, adaptable, something that someone who can be easily taught is easily malleable. So it really does fit. But we want to be really used to, really comfortable with the idea of picking answer words that we don't know when we don't know the actual definition of the vocabulary, as long as we're confidently able to say that the other words don't fit. So that's number 25 is C. Now let's go to number 26. The author of passage 2 refers to the novel War and Peace to suggest what? Okay, so we have 26. So what was going on when the author of passage 2 mentioned Woody Allen and War and Peace? The verdict was rendered by Woody Allen after he read Leo Tolstoy's famous novel War and Peace in one sitting. It was about Russia. I may need to start a little earlier. Experience doesn't revamp the basic information processing capabilities of the brain. Speed reading programs have long claimed to do just that. But speed reading programs have long claimed to do just what? To revamp the basic information processing capacities of the brain. So starting over, experience does not revamp the basic processing capacities of the brain. Speed reading programs have claimed to do that, but the verdict was rendered by Woody Allen. So speed reading programs have claimed to be able to revamp our brain, but when Woody Allen read War and Peace, he said that doesn't happen. So now I'm not reading the passage. I'm just going based off the word but, right? Because it says speed reading programs have long claimed to do that, to revamp the information processing capacities of the brain. But, so the but right there just says that whatever Woody Allen discovered was the opposite of that, and was basically pointing to the idea that experience does not revamp the information processing capacities of the brain. So in our own words, Woody Allen said that that doesn't happen, that certain activities don't revamp the brain. So Allen did not like Tolstoy's writing style, irrelevant. He could not comprehend the novel by speed reading it, possibly. He had become quite skilled at multitasking. It wasn't even about multitasking, so that's irrelevant. Regretted having read such a long novel. Also looks irrelevant to me. Also, I'm not seeing anything about him saying he regretted reading it. So now, why does B fit? B is a little more literal. You know, like we say, when you answer in your own words, occasionally you may just be a little different than what the test intended, and that's okay, because you're still in a position of power for making good decisions. So what happened with Woody Allen? He read War and Peace in one sitting, and when he finished, he said it was about Russia. So, in other words, he didn't deeply understand it. He didn't get anything out of it. So he could not comprehend the novel. Fits what we just said right now for number 26. Let's go to number 27. According to the author of passage 2, okay, 1 second. Little note to Microsoft: when you undo writing, other windows reset. According to the author of passage 2, what do novelists and scientists have in common? So do we see anything in here about novelists and scientists? Okay, I see novelists right there and scientists right here. Okay, so we're going to refer to what they asked us about as the line reference. The line reference when they talked about novelists and scientists was around lines 79 to 80. And we're going to call the line reference the what. The area right before and after it will be the why. So just to give us the point here, this green line doesn't really tell us much if we don't know what was happening around it. So kind of like on our vocab, passage-based vocab questions, we're talking about assessing the momentary main idea, the thing that was being said in the passage at that moment. So let's maybe start reading from line 70. The effects of experience are specific to the experience themselves. So the effects of experience are specific to the experience themselves. If you train people to do one thing, they get better at that thing, but almost nothing else. Music doesn't make you better at math. Latin doesn't make you more logical. Brain training games don't make you smarter. Accomplished people don't bulk up their brains with calisthenics. They immerse themselves in their fields. So they get so deep into their fields, they get good at that, but it doesn't necessarily spread to anything else, because it says right here, the effects of experience are specific to the experience. So novelists, according to that line of thought, are good at novels. Scientists are good at science. So what do novelists and scientists have in common? Now, in our own words, this is one that we can definitely read in our own words. That novelists and scientists both get into their own fields very deeply, not necessarily into other unrelated fields. So is it about taking risks, about improving their minds, being curious about other subjects, or becoming absorbed in their fields? We said they get into their own fields deeply. That absolutely matches choice D. They become absorbed in their own fields. So looking at number 28, the analogy in the final sentence of passage 2. So let's go ahead and go over there. Final sentence of passage 2. As with ancient people who believe that eating fierce animals made them fierce, they assume that watching quick cuts and rock videos turns your mental life into quick cuts, or that reading bullet points turns your thoughts into bullet points in online postings. So it's talking about what other people think. They assume, and assuming has a negative connotation. You're making an assumption. Not always, but here it's definitely being used that way. And who's it being compared to? Who's it being compared to? It's being compared to people who had these ridiculous beliefs. Eating fierce animals made them fierce. So it's comparing people who make assumptions about technology to primitive people who essentially don't know what they're talking about. And I spelled primitive wrong, didn't I? Yes, I did. All right. Comparing to primitives, the analogy in the final sentence of passage 2 has what effect? It's comparing people who believe what passage 1 believed to primitive people, because they make this assumption that's just in no way founded. So is it using ornate language? It's not ornate language. It's just sort of a deep comparison, right? But the language itself is not, they're not overly complicated words or beautiful words, which might be what ornate means. Does it employ humor? I kind of find what they said a little funny, but I don't think it was overtly a joke. It alludes to the past to evoke a nostalgic response. What's nostalgia? Nostalgia is like emotion over the past. Like if I remember back to when my kids were babies and I get nostalgic, that's not what's happening here at all. Criticizes the view of a particular group. Well, yeah, it's criticizing that group because it's saying, when you guys talk that way, you sound like primitive people who don't make any sense. So 28 is D because it absolutely is comparing what's going on to, or comparing what people are doing in current times to what primitive people did. So 28 is going to be D. Now let's go to 29. The main purpose of each passage, just going off of what we've been doing for our main idea. Number 1 says that certain activities change the brain. And passage 2 says that certain activities don't change the brain. Because people who think that are similar to people who believe that eating fierce animals makes you fierce. So doing different activities changes you as well. And it pointed out the ridiculousness of that view in their point of view. So now let's look at which answer says that. The main purpose of each passage is to make a statement that either activity changes the brain or that it doesn't. Making an argument about the effect of electronic media use on the brain. Choice D sounds perfect. Alrighty, so we have number 29 and we're going to question 30 now. The relationship between the two passages. Well, like we said a second ago, Passage 1 says that electronics changes the brain. It first says it positively and then says it negatively. And passage 2 says that use of electronics doesn't change the brain. And it sort of gets into different fields like novelists and scientists and mathematics to show that, you know, concentrations and things cause us to change ourselves in terms of what we know, but our brain is still our brain. So electronics changes the brain, electronics doesn't change the brain. Passage 2 relates a firsthand experience that contrasts with the clinical approach in passage 1. They both, in my opinion, have an equally clinical approach. Passage 2 critiques the conclusions drawn from the research in passage 1. I may want to go back and see, was there actually research being discussed in passage 1? Yeah, right here around line 25 to 27. In an article, Greenfield reviewed more than 40 studies. So that's research that was being done. Passage 2 takes a high level view of a result that passage 1 examines in depth. So they're both high level. It wasn't at all close to what we said in our own words. Passage 2, choice D, passage 2 predicts the negative reactions. So predicting negative reactions would be, what would it sound like? What would a passage like that sound like? Wow, when people hear this, they're going to react terribly. Not at all what we heard in there. So the answer to number 30 is going to be B. Now we're going to number 31. On which of the following points would the authors of both passages most likely agree? Well, passage 1 said that certain activities change the brain. So there might be some activities that might make us better or worse. Passage 2 said that we do have changes, but they're superficial changes. So for instance, going back into passage 2 for a moment, the effects of experience are specific to the experiences themselves. So if you train people to do one thing, they get better at doing that thing, but almost nothing else. So they don't overall change as people, is what's being said. So computer savvy children tend to demonstrate better hand-eye coordination than do their parents. I don't know if it's being compared to their parents. It's being compared to people who didn't have that practice. So far I don't like A. B, those who criticize consumers of electronic media tend to overreact. Well, passage 2 might say that people are overreacting because experience doesn't really change the brain. So you're overreacting if you think that it does. When you have something for both passages, it's saying what would both passages agree with? Beware of the answer choice that talks about just one answer choice, because that's an easy way to sort of take us off track. We will recognize what we read because we did read it. It's just that we didn't read it in both. So C, improve visual spatial skills do not generalize to improve skills in other areas. I think we might want to save that one for later because passage 2 definitely said that. It says it right here in line 74 or in line 70. The effects of experience are specific to the experience themselves. So if you work on your visual spatial skills, that's only specific to visual spatial skills. And in passage 1, did it say something similar? Let's see. So web browsing strengthens brain functions related to fast-paced problem solving. So web browsing involves fast-paced problem solving. So it's not that it's making us smarter. It says it would be a mistake to conclude that. It's not that it's making us smarter. It's just that it's developing some cognitive skills at the expense of others. So right here, it's saying that it would be a mistake to feel like you're going to be made smarter by what you do. You're going to develop some skills, you're going to lose others. So improved skills in one area are going to be at the expense of others. They're going to not just not help the others, but they might even hurt the others. So definitely 31 seems to, choice C in 31 seems to agree with both passages. And looking at D for a moment, internet users are unlikely to prefer reading on screen. I just didn't see anything about that anywhere in the passage. So 31 is going to be C. And 32, which choice provides the best evidence that the author of passage 2 would agree to some extent with the claim attributed to Michael Merzenich in 41 to 43 passage 1? Okay, so here is our question with lots of moving parts. You know, because they're asking us about passage 2, passage 1, and evidence, and there's just lots of different things going on. So we want to take them little by little. So first of all, what did Michael Merzenich in 41 to 43 of passage 1 say? Okay, so this is what Michael Merzenich says, and of course it's split between two different columns. So it's a little more confusing as far as making sense of it without losing your train of thought. But Merzenich said, when we adapt to a new cultural phenomenon, including the use of a new medium, we end up with a different brain. So when we adapt to something new, so a new activity gives us a new brain. So that's what Michael Merzenich said. So where do we see the idea the author of passage 2 would agree somewhat with that? So looking through the passage, they talked about the effects of experience that are specific to the experiences themselves. And you get better at doing a certain thing. So for instance, according to lines 70 to 74, if you practice your communication ability every day, you may end up with an ability, or maybe we could call it a brain, that's better at that exact activity, which in this example is communication. So let's go ahead and see which answer choices kind of match that view that a new activity gives us a new brain. So 51 to 53. Critics of new media sometimes use science itself to press their case, citing research that shows that experience can change the brain. So right here, it's saying this is what the critics think. So because of that, it's not telling us at all what the author of passage 2 thinks. Because like I said, it's talking about what critics say. So we can get rid of choice A. Choice B, every time we learn a fact or skill, the wiring of the brain changes. Okay, so every time we learn a fact or skill, the wiring of the brain changes. New activity leads to a new brain, or at least the wiring of a new brain. So that's the idea of agreeing to some extent. That in passage 1, they said that's a whole new brain. In passage 2, it says, well, yeah, the wiring of the brain changes. So we're agreeing to some extent. So the answer to number 32 is going to be B. And now we're on to a whole new passage. And it's our antiquated 1700s or 1800s passage. So we have to gear ourselves up to read this incredibly dense and old-fashioned writing, which is one of the tougher things about the SAT overall. So once again, we're speed reading. We're trying our best to focus on verbs, but more than anything else, we're allowing our brain to do what it naturally can do, which is to get rid of words that are not so necessary in our first read. This passage is adapted from Stanton's address to the 1869 Suffrage Convention, Women's Suffrage Convention in DC. So in 1869, it has to do that with the idea that women need to be given the ability to vote, suffrage. So I urge a 16th Amendment because manhood suffrage or man's government is civil and social disorganization. The male element is a destructive force resulting in disease and death, if I skip to the end. See what a record of blood and cruelty the pages of history reveal. Through what slavery, slaughter, sacrifice, the soul of humanity has struggled for centuries, while mercy has veiled her face, and all hearts have been dead, alike to love and hope. So men's law is all this nasty stuff: war, violence, conquest, acquisition, blood, and cruelty. Slavery, slaughter, sacrifice. But mercy and love and hope have struggled. So it's kind of saying that that's what men do and that's what women do. The male element has held high carnival. It has run riot from the beginning, overpowering the female element everywhere, crushing the diviner qualities until we know but little of true manhood and womanhood. It has scarce been recognized as a power until within the last century. Society is but the reflection of man himself, untempered by women's thought. The iron rule we feel alike in the church, state, and home. No one need wonder at the disorganization, the condition of everything. We remember that a man who represents half a complete being with but half an idea on every subject has undertaken the absolute control of all matters. People object to the demands of those whom they choose to call the strong-minded because they say the right of suffrage will make the woman masculine. That is just a difficulty we're involved today. We have so many women in the best sense. We have simply so many reflections of the masculine gender. The characteristics of women are repressed and ignored. Independence. For so long as man feeds woman, she will try to please the giver and adapt herself. To keep a foothold in society, woman must be as near like man as possible, reflect his ideas. She must respect his statutes, though they strip her of every right and conflict with that higher law written by the finger of God. Man has been molding woman to his ideas by influences, while she has used indirect means to control him, in most cases developed the characteristics both in him and herself that needed repression. Now man stands appalled at the results of his excesses and mourns in bitterness that falsehood, selfishness, and violence are the law of life. The need of this hour is not territory, gold mines, railroads, or specie payments, but a new evangel of womanhood. So the need is not the things that man can give, but the things that women can give, like purity, virtue, morality, religion, to lift up man to the higher realms. We ask women's enfranchisement as the first step toward the recognition of that element that can only secure health, strength, and prosperity of the nation. Whatever is done to lift women to her true position will help to usher in a new day of peace and perfection. In speaking of the masculine element, I do not wish to be understood to say that all men are hard, selfish, brutal. For many of the most beautiful spirits the world has known have been clothed with manhood, but I refer to those characteristics that distinguish what is called the stronger sex. For example, the love of acquisition and conquest, the pioneers of civilization, when expanded on the earth, see the elements, when used to subjugate one man or another. Okay, great. We're sort of speed reading through. Here, the great conservative of woman's love, if permitted to assert itself, as it naturally would in freedom against oppression, violence, and war, would hold all these destructive forces in check. For woman knows the cost of life better than man does, and not with her consent would one drop of blood be shed, one life sacrificed in vain. So we're just looking through the passage and seeing that the idea of women's voting is being used to express the idea that society needs more of a feminine element of love as opposed to violence. So looking at question 33, the central problem that Stanton describes in the passage is that women have been excluded, or their view, their softness has been excluded from government, from managing society. Denied equal educational opportunities. I didn't see educational opportunities here. They might have been in there, but during the speed read, I didn't see them so much. Women have been preventing from exerting their positive influence on men, which has led to societal breakdown. I would have liked to see influence on society, but I'll take influence on men there. Prevented from voting, which has resulted in poor candidates. It's not the candidates, but it's the element of womanhood that's being discussed throughout. Blocked by men from serving as legislators, which has allowed to the creation of unjust laws. The laws themselves don't seem to be the thing that were discussed. It was more the influence on society. So for number 33, we're going to go ahead and go with B. Women have been prevented from exerting their positive influence on men, has led to societal breakdown. Let's go ahead and just kind of verify that one in the passage. Maybe right here where it says, no one need wonder at the disorganization, at the fragmentary condition of everything, when we remember that man, who represents but half a complete being, with but half an idea on every subject, has undertaken the absolute control of all sublunary matters. So everything is all disorganized and fragmented because only men are in charge. So without the positive influence of women, with only the influence of men, there's been societal breakdown. So women are prevented from exerting their influence on men, and that's led to societal breakdown. So the answer to number 33 is B. Going over to number 34 now. Stanton uses the phrase high carnival to emphasize what she sees as. So it says, the male element has held high carnival thus far. It has fairly run riot from the beginning. So what do they mean by high carnival? It's the idea that men have totally dominated, right? So in our own words, when they say high carnival, they're saying that men are dominating. So it emphasizes what she sees as the domination of women by men. Pretty good. The freewheeling spirit. The free spirit, I don't think is what we just saw. We saw men dominating. The decline in moral values. It kind of leads to that. The passage says that it leads to that, but at that moment, it's not talking about that. The growing power of women in society. Well, that's the opposite of what we want. We're seeing that men, the male element, has run rampant, has held high carnival. So the answer to number 34 is going to be A. 35. Stanton claims that which of the following was a relatively recent historical development? I remember reading that through, but don't remember exactly where it is. Maybe right around here. We know but little of true manhood and womanhood, of the latter comparatively nothing. So of womanhood, we know comparatively nothing, for it has scarce been recognized as a power until the last century. So what was a relatively recent historical development? Women being recognized as a power. The acknowledgement of women's true character. Actually, that's better than the way I said it. We know but little of true womanhood, so woman's true character, until within the last century. So 35 is going to be D, based on lines 19 to 23, in my opinion. And 36 is asking for the evidence. And so I said 19 to 23. The passage is saying 15 to 22, but they overlap with one another. So the answer to 36 is going to be B. 37, as used in line 24, rule most nearly refers to. So line 24. So what we were reading before, we know little of true manhood and womanhood. of womanhood comparatively nothing, for it's scarcely been recognized as a power until within the last century. Society is the reflection of man himself, untempered by women's thought, the hard iron rule we feel alike in the church, state, and home. Society is a reflection of man himself, the reflection of man himself, untempered by women's thought. So men are running society, or they're heavily influencing society with no temper from women's thought. So it's being unlimited by women's thought. So there's a hard iron rule. It's men once again dominating. So now we're inventing our own word. This is our passage-based vocab where we're looking for the momentary main idea. And then we're going to invent our word after that. So we did the momentary main idea already. And now we need to kind of invent our own word. So I might say the hard iron, maybe in my words, tough presence of men who dominate and don't let women influence society. So what's a tough presence? A controlling force. So the answer to number 37 is going to be B. 38. It can be inferred that the strong-minded was a term intended to do what? So 32. People object to the demands of those whom they choose to call the strong-minded because they say the right of suffrage will make women masculine. So we're talking about women being strong-minded and the idea that they're going to become masculine and that wouldn't be a good thing. So the strong-minded was a term intended to do what? To say that women would become less like women. So to criticize women who are entering into male-dominated professions, saying that that's going to make them overly masculine, is what we were reading on 31 to 34. So 38 is going to be, let's think about 38 for 1 second, though. People object to the demands of those whom they choose to call the strong-minded because they say the right of suffrage will make women masculine. Though disenfranchised, we have few women in the best sense. So what are the demands of those whom they choose to call the strong-minded? The demands in this passage, it's the suffrage convention. So the demands are demands of voting. So it can be inferred that the strong-minded was a term intended to, as much as, thinking about the idea of women entering into male-dominated professions, because we're thinking of women being masculine. So we're thinking of women doing things that men do. We don't actually see anything else in there about professions. That's the problem with choice C. There's no mention about jobs in there, but there is a mention about, in yellow, the demands and the disenfranchisement. So the answer 38, actually, as tempting as C was, it's actually going to be D. Condemn women who agitate for the vote for their sex. The demands is the voting demands, and disfranchisement is the idea that they don't have that voting right yet. So going over now to number 39. 39 is, once again, our passage-based vocab. We want our momentary main idea, and then we want to invent a word. So what was happening around line 36, which we just read? It's saying, even though we're disfranchised, we have few women in the best sense. Instead of having women in the best sense, we have reflections, varieties, and dilutions of the masculine gender. So it's saying that there's this heavy influence of men on society. So we don't really have true women. We don't have true womanhood. And so we don't have women in the maybe truest sense. Instead of that, we have all these dilutions of manhood. So now in terms of inventing my own word, I said we don't have women in the truest sense. And so the answer is going to be C, genuine. So going over to number 40 now. Stanton contends that the situation she describes in the passage has become so dire that even men have begun to. So, we want to take confidence here and know that if they say the situation is so dire that, we're going to look for some line that says things are so bad that. So let's see what we can find. So just looking through, man has been molding women into her ideas. He's used indirect means. Man himself stands appalled at the results of his own excesses and mourns in bitterness that falsehood, selfishness, and violence are the law of life. So that might be one right there. It says man himself is appalled at the results of his excesses and mourns at the falsehood, selfishness, and violence that are ways of life. So man himself is appalled at this. So man himself, maybe he sort of condemns it or he laments it. The word I was kind of thinking was he disapproves of it. So in number 40, choice A, based on lines 53 to 56, says, man laments the problems that have been created. So the answer number 40 is going to be A. 41, evidence for the answer to the previous question. And like we always say, when you're doing this right, you've already got that question when you get to it. So the answer number 41 is going to be B for boy. Going over to number 42 now. The sixth paragraph is concerned with establishing a contrast between. So let's do that in our own words. In speaking of the masculine element, I do not wish to be understood to say that all men are hard, selfish, brutal, for many of the most beautiful spirits in the world has known have been clothed with manhood, but I refer to those characteristics. So I do not wish to be understood to say that it's all men that I'm talking about, but I refer to those characteristics that distinguish what's called the stronger sex. So we're not talking about men, we're talking about their characteristics. That would be choice D, the contrast between men and masculine traits for number 42. So we're going over to 43 now. Okay, 43 is a whole new passage. So let's go ahead and do our speed read of that passage now. If you're seeing this for the first time, we are letting our mind do what it can do if we just allow it to, which is that our minds can identify the words that are less important than the other words in there. So we're kind of getting rid of unnecessary words, trusting that our mind's actually reading the rest of them anyway in a faster pace. We're trusting that we can always come back later, which we plan on doing, and we want to leave time for that. And we're paying extra attention to verbs. So just a quick word on verbs. We say this frequently, but the verbs you want to know about are is, was, are, am, were, be, have, has, and had. These are our important verbs. And not verbs are words that start with to do words, and ing words are not verbs. So let's go ahead and get started here. This passage is adapted from Jeffrey Giller. How 500-meter high undersea waves form is revealed. Some of the largest waves in the world are nearly impossible to see. Unlike other waves, they do not ride the ocean surface. Instead, they move underwater undetectable. Despite their nature, internal waves are fundamental parts of ocean water dynamics, and they can reach staggering heights, some as tall as skyscrapers. Because these waves are involved in ocean mixing and thus the transfer of heat, understanding them is crucial to a global climate modeling, says Tom Peacock. Most models fail to take internal waves into account. If we want to have more accurate models, we have to be able to capture processes such as this. Peacock and his colleagues tried to do just that. Their study focused on internal waves, which separates Taiwan and the Philippines. Internal waves, thought to be some of the largest in the world, can reach about 500 meters high. That is the same as the height of the Freedom Tower that's just been built in New York, Peacock says. Although scientists knew of this phenomenon in the South Sea and beyond, they didn't know in exactly how internal waves form. To find out, Peacock and a team of researchers from MIT worked with France's Center for Whatever. The platform churns at variable speeds and can simulate Earth's rotation. It has walls, which means scientists can fill it with water and create accurate, large-scale simulations. Peacock and his team built a carbon fiber resin scale model of the Luzon Strait, including the islands and surrounding ocean floor topography. They then filled the platform with water to replicate the densities of the strait. With saltier water, particles were added and illuminated with lights to track how the liquid moved. Finally, they recreated tides using two large plungers to see how the internal waves formed. The Luzon Strait's underwater topography turns out to be responsible for generating the underwater waves. As the tide rises and falls and water moves through the strait, cold that was a case of a falling microphone. Apologies. But we're going through starting on line 53 right now. The Luzon Strait's topography turns out to be responsible for generating the underwater waves. As the tide rises and falls, water moves through the strait. Colder, denser water is pushed up over the ridges. The action results in bumps of colder water trailed. You see, if you try to keep too much track of this right now, it's just too much and there's no real reason to keep track of it. We just need to know that all this stuff happens. A bunch of stuff happens. As these waves move toward land, they become steeper until they break on a continental shelf. The researchers were also able to devise a mathematical model that describes the movement and formation. The model is specific to Luzon Strait. It can still help researchers understand how internal waves are generated in other places around the world. This information will be incorporated into climate models, making them more accurate. It's very clear within the context of these models that internal waves play a role in driving ocean circulations. Exciting stuff. Sorry if there's any geologists out there who I'm offending. Let's go ahead to number 43. The first paragraph serves mainly to do what? So let's just answer that in our own words. What's the first paragraph apparently doing? So we already highlighted verbs in there. Now we can go back and highlight subjects. The largest waves in the world are impossible to see. Unlike other waves, these internal waves do not ride the surface. Instead, they move underwater, undetectable. Despite their hidden nature, the waves are fundamental parts of ocean water dynamics because they transfer heat and bring up cold water. They can reach staggering heights as tall as skyscrapers. So it's letting us know about something we are maybe not aware of. These internal waves and how they're maybe like surprisingly important. So something is surprisingly important. That could be a common misconception, but I don't think it's an event. It's about something that happens, a natural phenomenon and its importance. So something we're not aware of, the idea of internal waves and how important they are. So the answer to number 43 is going to be C. Line 19, capture. Okay, so we have for number 44, our passage-based vocab, and we want our momentary main idea, and then we want to invent a word to replace the word in question. So the momentary main idea around line 19 is that we want to capture processes. So starting in the beginning, the waves are involved in ocean mixing. Understanding those waves is important. And the models fail to take internal waves into account. We want to have more accurate models. We have to be able to capture processes. So we have to, like, we want better models, we have to be able to record data on these processes. So in my own words, I'm inventing record data as synonym for capture. And I promise I didn't look at choice B, but they use the word record, which exactly goes with it. So for 44, the answer is going to be B. And now we're going on to questions 45. According to Peacock, the ability to monitor internal waves is significant because, so our confidence here comes from the idea that we know there must be a phrase somewhere in the passage that says this. So we're looking through the passage and we're looking for it to say it's important to monitor the waves because, and coincidentally, I was just looking here, understanding these waves is crucial to climate modeling. So because these waves are involved in ocean mixing and the transfer of heat, understanding them is crucial to global climate monitoring. So it's allowing scientists to verify the maximum height. It's allowing researchers to shift their focus. The study of wave patterns is enabling regions to predict and prevent coastal damage. The study of such waves will inform the development of key scientific models crucial to global climate modeling, inform the development of key scientific models. So choice D exactly matches what we saw on 13 to 15. So 45 can be D. And like we said, we saw that around 13 to 15. That's not being offered to us. But let's see. Does line 1 to 2 say something similar? Now, when you get the evidence question, you want to be able to restate. In that one situation where you didn't already have the quote, you want to really be able to restate what you just said. We overestimate that we remember what we just picked. So the ability to monitor internal waves is significant because the study of such waves will inform the development of key scientific models. Now that we're clear on that, we can go back and quite easily decide. So some of the largest ocean waves in the world are impossible to see. So that's just not really related. 4 to 6, they move underwater undetectable without the use of satellite imagery or sophisticated monitoring equipment. So they're undetectable. And so studying them is going to allow us to maybe develop a model because they're currently undetectable. So I like B on 46, at least so far. 17 to 19, most models fail to take internal waves into account. If we want to have more accurate climate models, we have to be able to capture processes such as these. So 17 and 19 is saying that if we want to have better climate models, we have to go ahead and get this information, which is exactly what we highlighted in blue. So the answer to 46 is going to be C. B was pretty good, but C was great on number 46. Now we're going over to 47. So here we have our passage-based vocab. We want our momentary main idea, and then we'll invent our own word. So in line 65, we're looking for the word devise. The researchers were able to devise a model that describes the movement and formation of these waves. So we're talking about specific research that was being done around the Luzon Strait. And based on that research, the researchers were able to come up with a mathematical model that describes the movement of the waves. So to me, I said they came up with their model. So to create their model was good. To imagine, it's not using your imagination as much as it is kind of creating something in response to something else. And you don't begin a model in the sense that we're talking about. We're talking about inventing one. So for 47, we're going to want to say A, invent, come up with, or create. 48, based on the information in the passage, it can be inferred that all internal waves. Now, very vague question. For vague questions, we say cheat. And of course, we don't really mean cheat. We just mean glance at the answer choices first. So is it that all of them reach the same height? That all of them are caused by similar factors, but influenced by distinct topographies? That sounds really good, doesn't it? That all of them can be traced to inconsistencies in tidal patterns? or all of them are generated by the movement of denser water over a flat section of the ocean floor. So let's see where they talk about, as we're going through these, I believe we're seeing mentions of the origins of them. And okay, so let's see where we see the things that they discovered. Underwater topography turns out to be responsible for generating underwater waves. So are they traced to the inconsistencies in the tidal patterns? We're talking about inconsistencies in the topography, which is like how mountainous they are. As the tide rises and falls and water moves through the strait, cold, denser water is pushed up over the ridge into the warmer, less dense layers above it. So then we have bumps of colder water trailed by warmer water that generate an internal wave. So we have it being influenced by the topography right here in yellow. So similar factors is the topography. Let's see. So let's see things we can pick out that are wrong with the wrong answer choices. They don't all reach the same height. We didn't see that in the passage. Are they all generated by denser water over a flat section? We saw topography, which is kind of the ideas of hills and mountains. So we have it down to choices B and C. Are they traced to inconsistencies in tidal patterns of the deep ocean water? Well, they're traced to, at the very beginning, topography, which is the idea of the hills and bumps underneath. So the basic thing is not the tides. We saw that topography influencing the tides, which caused the wave. So at its base, it wasn't the tidal patterns. So we can get rid of C based on that. And they may be caused by similar factors, but are influenced by the topographies. So what are the similar factors? The underwater topography and the tides rising and falling, but they're influenced by the distinct topographies, which is exactly what we saw on line 53. So the evidence for that, for us, we were seeing it primarily around lines 53 to 56, but what are we seeing in 56 to 58? Let's clean this up a little. As the tide rises and falls and water moves up through the strait, colder, denser water is pushed up. Well, this one is about the Luzon Strait in particular. So maybe as evidence, I don't like it as much. So let's try some of the other ones. We'll leave that one at least for later because it was where we were looking. 29 to 31 says, scientists knew of this phenomenon. They didn't know how internal waves formed. So here we're seeing what scientists don't know, which is the opposite of what we want. Okay, so now we're looking at choice C, 61 to 64. 61 to 64. As these waves move more toward land, this is where we were talking about the Luzon Strait still. So we're still really specific. As these waves move toward land, they're much steeper until they break on a continental shelf. So it is talking about how they form, but there's nothing about, when we're looking for the evidence-based questions on a harder one, we want to really restate what we just answered previously. So what we're really looking for here is, once again, we're looking for all internal waves are caused by similar factors, but influenced by the distinct topographies of the different regions. So let's look at, so it just doesn't match choice C from what we're seeing here. We're seeing choice C as saying, as sort of describing the process, but not talking about the similarity. And then 67 to 70. Whereas the model is specific to the Luzon Strait, it can help researchers understand how internal waves are generated in other places around the world. So right there, we see how there's similar factors in the fact that they relate to one another, influenced by the distinct region, is where it says around line 68 that this is specific to the Luzon Strait. So they all relate, but it is specific to different regions. And as you can see by the way I described that, 48 and 49 are very high level difficulty questions in my opinion. Now we're going to number 50. In the graph, which isotherm displays an increase in depth below the surface during the period 1912 to 2024? So we're talking about 1912 to 2024, which is right here. And in this period, which isotherm displays an increase in depth? That's a confusing sort of phrase because increase means it's going up, but depth means it's going down. So we're talking about it getting deeper during that time. Notice that these three are all on their way up. This is the only one that's going downward. So we'll be answering that with choice D for number 50, 13 degrees Celsius. Which concept is supported by the passage and by the graph? Let's start with the graph because it's easier. The graph is, the overall trend I'm seeing in the graph is that the different isotherms, whatever they are, kind of are consistent with one another. When one is going up, for the most part, they're all going up. Like they all seem to go down around here. They all seem to have another little dip around here as well. So there's like a similarity to the way they all coincide with one another. So I guess looking through these, the one thing I'm seeing that wasn't in the way I answered in my own words is that they do not rise to break the ocean's surface, because the surface of the ocean is right here and none of those lines break that surface. So for 51, we'll say D. And 52 is again about the graph. Maybe this matches our overall trend that they're consistent with one another. So wave movement forces warmer water down to depths that are typically colder. I could see that because, for instance, the warmer water here would be the 13, which is this purple one. And the waves push the 13 down to places where the 11 and the 10 and the 9 normally live. So A sounds really good to me. It reveals the degree to which an internal wave affects the density. I'm not seeing anything about density. Illustrates the change in surface temperature that takes place. Surface temperature is right here, and there's once again nothing about that. And choice D. Multiple waves rising near the surface of the ocean disrupt the flow. So the surface of the ocean is not what's disrupting the flow. We're talking more about the internal waves, which are by definition not near the surface. So thanks for listening to our explanation of SAT Test 2, Section 1. And we're working really hard to produce more and more valuable information that can help you study for the SAT and hopefully at some point soon the ACT as well. Thanks so much for visiting Gradeful. Have a wonderful day.